was a cold night, and the streets of Toptown were dank and filthy from the storm that afternoon. Tack shivered and sneezed as she made her way through the ginnels between the tightly packed houses. You'd think it was no night to be out on, but in fact it was All Hallows Eve, and Tack brushed against the tightly huddled little groups, families and friends, holding gruesomely decorated lanterns as they made their way from house to house. "Trick or treat!" they called. It was almost a greeting to other groups in the street, and the children, warmly bundled against the cold, giggled, and the adults smiled and laughed. "Trick or treat!" they called as they banged on the doors of the houses of Toptown. The bulging bags they carried told of the willingness of people to hand out treats, bright oranges, crunchy honeycomb, or dark, rich treacle toffee. Although there were a few egged front doors that told of residents who'd settled for tricks, or had perhaps just been unfortunate enough to delay answering. Tack stuck to the shadows. It was to protect their offspring from people like Tack that the adults accompanied the little bands of children. Tack, they reckoned, was the kind of person who would push their little darlings over into the mud and steal the candy they clutched. And they were right. But, in fact, they were also wrong, because although Tack would have dearly loved a bag of toffee all to herself, old Bart was looking for bigger game, and he'd expect her to carry home something translatable into ready cash. Failure to do so would translate into another beating on top of the one she'd received that morning. So she eased her way up to the family groups when no one was looking and slipped her hands into unguarded pockets and foolishly opened bags. But she was all too well aware that her haul was a couple of wipes and 3 slender purses. The rain was starting again, a low, relentless drizzle that was clearing all but the most determined from the streets. Tack pulled her ragged jacket closer around her thin shoulders and headed for the only place she knew as home.
There was a smell of sausages and onions in the air as she pushed open the rickety wooden door. Tack's mouth watered. In the cavernous room behind the door, old Bart, dirty as the children, wizened with age but sharp-eyed as ever, was standing over the fire, bending over to turn the sausages in the blackened frying pan with a rusted toasting fork, bending so low that the heat threatened to add the grease from his straggly gray locks to the mess in the pan. Around him was a circle of children, none older than 12, their clothes ragged and filthy, and their hair and skin not much cleaner. Some of the lucky ones held bread in their hands. These were the ones who had made the most today. The sausages and onions would be placed on the bread for them. The rest would be left to fight for what they could get from the pan. Several looked up as Tack came into the room, but only the youngest, Mikey, smiled at her. Mikey was Bart's latest acquisition, bought for 5 shillings from a chimney sweep who'd found him too frightened to crawl up the long, winding chimneys of Lordstown. He was young to Bart's trade, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, and he was slow to pick up the tricks the others had long since mastered. In the fight for food and survival, he was losing, despite Tack slipping him what she could. She tried to smile back at him, but she was well aware that Bart was going to be far from happy with her takings. "Well," said the old man, waving the toasting fork at her. Reluctantly, she pulled out the silken handkerchiefs and the slender purses, laying them on the knife-scarred table as tradition demanded. Old Bart left the sausages and shuffled across in his broken slippers to inspect the haul, turning them over contemptuously. "Call this a good night's haul? And on All Hallows Eve, too." "It was raining," said Tack sullenly. "It was it?" said old Bart. "Well, rain or no rain, you can get out there again, and don't come back till you find something better than this."
The streets were deserted now, the rain coming down steadily. Tack trudged along, her thin shoulders hunched against the cold. People usually took Tack for a boy of around 10 or 11, but on both counts they were wrong. She was a girl, and she was, at best as she could tell, nearly 14. Long past time to have been sold on to the flesh merchants, you might have thought. But Tack's skills as a thief and housebreaker had caused old Bart to keep her in his employ for as long as possible. And this All Hallows Eve, it looked as though she needed to utilize the second of her skills. She paused, shivering, at the corner of the main square. Usually she would travel down to Middletown if she wanted to break into homes. But this night she would be happy to stay as close to home as she dared. And there were certainly a few large houses here that were worth a look. There was one house on the main square, a tall, somewhat grave-looking house, with a secure wooden door guarded by 2 heavy stone pillars. It usually seemed dark and deserted, abandoned, but tonight it had a light gleaming under the door. That was not the way in. She had to find a suitable window, and the ones on the side facing the square were too obvious. They could be seen from the neighboring houses. The back of the house faced onto the edge, overlooking the precipitate cliff that descended to the riches of Lordstown at the cliff's base, and most of the windows gave on to that side. She took a deep breath and made a running jump to a drain pipe that ran up the side of a low, steep-roofed building right next to the targeted house. It was the work of a minute to climb it, and then scramble onto the slate roof and up to the top. Dropping down the other side was more problematic. One misstep on the rain-slick slates, and she could go sliding and tumbling her way down to Lordstown, hundreds of feet below. Cautiously, she slid a few feet, then pressed against the angle of the wall to move to the house she had targeted. She could see the light from one of the windows clearly here, but she had to move with extra caution. Look too long at that light, and her eyes could be dazzled so much she might miss the buttresses and gaps in the wall that she needed to climb around. She compromised with quick looks to check her position, a pause to let her eyes become accustomed to darkness again, and then climbing cautiously a few paces. It seemed to take an age, and her arms and legs were shaking with the effort of holding on tightly. But she finally made the lighted window, planning to use it to see what was inside. She pulled herself up so that she could peep through the glass, and as she did so, she felt it move slightly. It was unlatched. Instinct made her lower her head below the level of the sill at once, but there seemed to be no sound within the room. Slowly, cautiously, she raised her head and peered in.
The room was a library. Tack had seen 1 or 2 before on burglary trips to Lordstown. She stared for a moment at the long rows of leather-bound volumes, feeling a sudden sharp pang. Books reminded her of her mother, one of the few people Tack had known who could read. She could remember listening to her mother's low, soothing voice as she read from one of the books that she hadn't been obliged to sell, as they shifted from one small lodgings to another, smaller lodgings. She had promised Tack that she would teach her to read too. But before that could happen, the low voice became weaker and interrupted by coughing. And then there was no talking, no coughing, no anything at all. Tack found her view of the books was wavering, and she shook her head to clear it. Reluctantly, she looked away from the books and studied the room more closely. Although it was hard to look away from the books, they were piled on the floor all across the room, as though the shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling were not enough to hold them all. Around the room were soft lamps, casting a warm glow. Near the centre of the room were a series of heavy sofas, upholstered in deep maroon velvet, their backs marked with buttons. In the centre was a table with a strange antique coffee service and bowls of candied fruits. There were more books here, arranged with some lying flat and some upright. But the thing that caught Tack's attention as she peered through the glass was a large ball of crystal in a graceful carved stand, also resting on the table. It was hard to tell through the glass, but were the colours contained in the ball swirling and changing? Tack could wait no longer. She knew that she should find another window or an unlit room, but this deserted library was just too tempting. Carefully, she pulled the unlatched window towards her, struggling to keep her balance. The window moved easily, suggesting the hinges were oiled regularly. She slid first one leg, then another over the sill, moving slowly and stealthily. Closer to the table, any of the strange decorated jugs would be enough to satisfy old Bart, enough to score food for her and Mikey for days. The crystal was still whirling and changing. There was something compelling about it, something that made her look away determinedly. The jug, though, if she could just... Trick or treat, little one. Tack started. She could have sworn on Mikey's life that there had been no one in the room. Slowly, so slowly, she turned and saw an old man sitting on one of the sofas behind her.
He was not like old Bart, she saw at once. He was dressed in a suit, the quality of which was usually seen in Lordstown rather than the top. His grey hair was clean and brushed back in two sweeping wings, and he had a neatly trimmed moustache and small pointed beard. "Oh no," he said, as though anticipating Tack's planned dive for the windows. "You don't need to go back that way. Much safer to depart through the front door." Tack sneered. "After you've called the Rozzers?" He gave a small sigh. "Now, why would I do that, when you've paid a visit on All Hallows Eve?" Tack hesitated. "You can call me Professor," said the old man. "So, what is it to be, Tack? Trick or treat?" "Treat," said Tack immediately, without thinking. Then she realized with a start the old man had used her name. The Professor chuckled. "And what shall that treat be, Tack?" She looked longingly at the dishes of candied fruits on the table. Her stomach hurt so much with hunger. Then she raised her head and looked at the Professor. He was watching her closely, and wanting to avoid his eyes, she instead looked around the marvellous room. There were so many beautiful objects here, rich and rare. Even the least of them would make old Bart wet himself with excitement, and would spare Tack a beating for as long as a week. And Tack somehow knew that if she asked for any of these objects, the Professor would give it to her. But there was something more, something deeper in this room. Tack looked at the shelves, the piles of books stacked up on the floor, and suddenly she knew what the treat should be. "I want to learn to read." The Professor gave a long, slow nod. "Wise, Tack," he said softly. "You might have chosen instant gratification or a short-term pleasure. Instead, you've chosen to think of the future, and more than that, you have chosen power." His voice was deep and slow, but suddenly it changed. Suddenly it became charged with a power of its own. "Very well, Tack. You can read." "What?" said Tack. She was well aware that reading was not a skill that came easily. Maggie at the market could write her own name and the names and prices of the goods she sold. Well, most of them. She'd attempted to teach Tack to read once, and it had been a hard struggle to even get T-A-K. "You can read, Tack," said the Professor. "Go over there and look at the books." Tack stared at him for a moment, and then headed in the direction he indicated, to one of the shelves. She looked along rows of leather-bound volumes, hoping to make out the occasional T, A, or K. Then she blinked. Each of the letters seemed to speak to her, forming the shapes of words she knew, and some she did not, but she could read them all. "Bleak House," she read, "by Charles Dickens." Well, she knew plenty of bleak houses. "Whistle and I'll Come for You," by M.R. James. What's that about? "Calling Out to Another World," said the Professor, and not liking what answers. Tack swung round and looked at him suspiciously. "There ain't no other worlds," she said, and then something made her add, with a note of uncertainty in her voice, "Is there?" "There are more things in heaven and earth, Tack, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, but if you read, you might start to learn." Tack gazed at him a moment longer and then turned back to the shelves. "It," she read, "by Stephen King." Well, that looked nice and simple. "You might have problems with that one," said the Professor apologetically. "I'm afraid it hasn't been written yet. Well, in your world." She turned again, frowning at him. "What do you mean?" "This library," said the Professor, "contains only a small proportion of the books that have ever been written, but some of them, let us just say I picked them up on my travels." Tack grinned. It seemed from his tone that the Professor wasn't above a little acquisition by dubious means himself. "So," said the Professor, "what will be your trick?" "Eh?" said Tack. "Your trick," he repeated. "You've had your treat, and now you may choose the trick."
There was something in the gleam of the Professor's eye that made Tack feel decidedly uneasy. "You want to play a trick on me?" she quavered. He shook his head. "No, little one. You shall have a trick to play on someone else. What would you like to do?" "I'd like to stop old Bart for good and all." The words burst from Tack before she could stop them. The Professor nodded, as though this was a reasonable request. "Now, what can we use?" he said, musing. He looked around the room at all the different treasures stored there. At last his gaze came to the central table. Ah, yes. With startling suddenness, he threw a cloth like an embroidered shawl over the globe. Tack didn't see where it came from. Then he stepped forward and lifted it, stand and all, still wrapped, and offered it to Tack. "Take this," he said. "Give it to him. He'll know it's valuable." For a moment it seemed as though he would say more, but instead he simply smiled. "Goodbye, Tack. Use your power wisely. And remember, you will always find something to read here." The wrapped globe in her arms was heavy and a little unwieldy, so at this clear dismissal, Tack nodded and turned to the door.
The streets were still slick with rain, so Tack was extra careful as she made her way back to Old Bart's. A swift glance round the den as she arrived showed that although a few of the gang were still awake, most of the rest had crawled into their narrow wooden beds, including Mikey. Several faces were missing. Tack guessed that they'd been sent on burglary raids near the harbor. Old Bart was still awake. Tack sometimes wondered if he'd ever slept. "Well," he barked at her, and then his eyes gleamed at the sight of the burden in her arms and the expensive-looking shawl that covered it. "What pretties have you brought old Bart, eh? There's me good girl." Carefully, Tack set the crystal ball on the table, still in its elegant stand. She moved to pull back the shawl, But old Bart waved her away. This was a treat he wanted for himself. He pulled the shawl away almost reverently, and Tack saw his eyes widening in the rich glow of the swirling light of the crystal. "What have you found me, my dear?" he murmured. But he was ignoring Tack, his gaze riveted on the ever-changing lights. "Oh, my! Oh, my!" His voice faded away, and still he gazed. His hands lifted and rested either side of the crystal, wizened old hands that had expertly handled a lifetime's worth and more of stolen goods. Tack looked into his face and saw the crystal doubly reflected in those keen old eyes, fluxing slowly from one crystalline shade to another. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It had to be the reflected light, but to Tack, his face seemed to have more wrinkles, and the starkness of the bones beneath the skin showed clearly. His hands, too, were becoming more like claws, more skeletal. She looked back at his face, and it was a death's head, with two glowing crystals where his eyes should have been. And still his lips moved, even as the skin was withering away. Suddenly, Tack moved fast over to Mikey's bunk and pulled the little boy out from the thin blankets. Mikey grizzled, but came, still wearing his day clothes for warmth. He stared around the room. "What?" he began, but Tack snarled, "Don't look! Don't look!"
The coldness of the street outside was almost merciful, unlike the horror inside. Tack shivered nonetheless. "Where are we going, Tack?" asked Mikey. Tack hesitated. "This way," she said. As she led him through the streets, she was aware of the first thin streaks of grey light that marked the beginning of All Hallows Day. She hadn't thought it so late, but perhaps she'd stared at old Bart for longer than she knew. The light reflected off the shiny cobbles and from the door of the great house of the square as they stood in front of it. Mikey clutched her hand tighter. "What we doing here, Tack?" he asked in a low, hoarse voice. "Shh," she said, and knocked. She was trying to work out what to say to the servant who had presumably answered the door, but no one came. Taking a deep breath, she knocked louder, conscious that across the square someone had thrown up a window and was watching. The door swung open a little from the force of her knock, rather than anyone else on the other side opening it. Tack took a deep breath and then pushed it further open so she and Mikey could walk inside. The first thing she noticed was the light, the cold, indifferent light of dawn. When she looked up, she could see the bare rafters and the gaping holes in the roof itself. The library was gone. The lights, the sofas, the rich flooring, and of course the books. It was bare stone now, with the dust of years, decades, drifting against the walls. "What we doing here, Tack?" repeated Mikey worriedly. His voice echoed in the blankness of the ruin. She didn't know. She didn't understand any of it, but still she had to try. "Professor?" she called. She hated her voice for wavering, but it didn't matter. There was no reply. And then she saw, lying in the very centre of the room, a book. It was leather-bound and seemed to have a large number of pages. She walked across the room slowly and crouched down to examine it more closely. Distantly, she seemed to hear a voice. "You will always find something to read here." "Can you read, Tack?" said Mikey, astonished. It seemed that she still could. But even so, she had difficulty spelling out the strange title of the book. What's it called, Tack? The Grand Grimoire, she said, and bent her head to read.